Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Vedamata, Chetan, Vishali, everyone. Good evening. So, in last class, we have started our discussion, come revision, discussion on previous year's question with the revision of topic of budget, fiscal policy, and debt management. Right, and I have shown you the questions they have asked in the previous years, right? They have the questions they have asked in previous years on budget, taxation. One question was related to finance commission. I'll also take this question, right? And after today's discussion, I'll share this PDF, annotations PDF, as well as some standard answers, model answer PDF. I'll also share with you after this class I'll share with you. Okay, so in the last class we have done how this budget is prepared and how this classification of the budget in what, in revenue budget, classification of budget in revenue budget and capital budget, right? Basically, we do classify expenditures and receipts in the head of revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. That's why they defined it as the revenue budget as well as capital budget. Okay, today we first have to revise our deficit part, ki how the deficit is classified and how this deficit is managed, and then we will take the fiscal policy part, right? And for going fiscal policy part, I will also explain you few things about taxation, ki how tax play a major role for the government to manage the fiscal policy, right? Under the fiscal policy, revenue, receipts, and expenditure both are required to be paid proper attention. Fine. So I'm going to discuss all these things today. First, let's discuss about the deficit and its management. So when we prepare a budget, we have to show the total expenditure and total receipts. Total expenditure is comprised of revenue expenditure plus capital expenditure, whereas total receipts is comprised of revenue receipts plus capital receipts. Okay, revenue receipts and capital receipts, revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. Now there are the three possibilities in this budget. One is total expenditure is greater than total receipts. Other possibility is both are going to be what? Equal, expenditure and receipts. Third possibility is what? Third possibility is expenditure is less than receipts. Okay, so this is going to show deficit in budget, neutral budget, and this one is going to be surplus budget, right? And see, sometimes what happened, because this budget is estimation of coming financial year, right? These estimations are estimations for coming financial year. Okay, and while giving the budget speech, finance minister is going to tell कि these are expected expenditures, these are expected receipts. So you are providing an estimate what is going to finally happen in our budget, but that is again an estimation, right? This is an estimation. So generally we do present the budget on 1st Feb. For example, this year on 1st Feb 2022 budget was presented, and that is for financial year 2022-2023, and government has presented the estimates for this financial year. Fine. Government has presented estimates for this financial year. For example, suppose estimated expenditure is somewhere around 34 lakh crore, right? Estimated expenditure, that is total expenditure, TE, somewhere around 34 lakh crore, and receipts is also 34 lakh crore, total receipts. So this is an estimate, the estimate which we have presented. So we call it as a budget estimate, right? BE, that is budget estimate. So after presenting the estimate from 1st of April 2022, government has started spending all those money, right? Government has started spending all that money. And what happened on 1st Feb 2023, government is again going to present financial year 2023-24 budget, right? On 1st Feb 2023, government will present the budget for what? Financial year 2023-2024. Fine. But on this date, this financial year is not completed yet. But government has presented certain estimates at the time of presentation of budget for financial year 2022-2023. So you have presented the estimates of this financial year, and next year when government is going to present the budget for 2023, on this date, this financial year is not over. But government already went to this financial year, and on this date, government is in fourth quarter of financial year 2022-2023. So by that time, when government will review, they have presented the budget estimate of 34 lakh crores and total receipts of 34 lakh crore. So government is going to present the budget estimates for financial year 2023-24, but government is also going to present revised estimates for financial year 2022-2023. Means whatever the possible changes are being there, right? They are going to present. So actually, every year when government present the budget, they present three things. One is the budget estimate, which is for upcoming financial year. Then they present the revised estimate, the financial year, which is already going on that date when the budget is presented. And they are also going to present final estimates of the financial year, which is already completed by this date, that is 2021-2022, right? So in this way, government present three data. So when we discuss all these kind of the deficit, right? When we discuss the deficits, so that is estimated deficit, right? The estimated deficit for financial year 2023-2024. Similarly, government is also going to present the revised estimate for financial year 2022-2023. So one is the possible data for upcoming financial year. One is the revised data for this financial year, which is already going on, and one for financial year, which is already completed, right? So that's why you can see that a lot of changes may be in the data, final data. Okay, but as of right now, we are concerned with all the deficits which government has present in their financial year. We have to focus on the concept part. So I told you there is a possibility either it is going to be greater than, or it is going to be equal to, or it is going to be less than. So generally, this part includes what? Borrowings, right? And borrowings is one of the most important source for the government in order to fulfill all its expenditure. So generally, we can see that if suppose that total expenditure is somewhere around 34 lakh crores, and receipts without borrowings, receipts without borrowing, suppose it is 28 lakh crore without borrowing. So what government is going to do? Government is going to borrow. Government have to borrow how much? Government have to borrow 6 lakh crores in order to make this expenditure and receipts going to be equal. But for a formulation, we have to write this budget deficit is equal to total expenditure minus total receipts. But in practically there will be no deficit in the budget because government is going to borrow the money in order to match their expenses, right? In order to match their expenses. Sometimes it is possible government is going to say that ki we have 37 lakh crores expenditure, 37 lakh crores expenditure, and we have 36 lakh crores TR, right? Government said that ki 37 lakh crores what total expenditure and 36 lakh crore is total receipts. That means clearly you can see that here budget deficit is 1 lakh crore. So some students say that, sir, you told us that in practical there is no budget deficit because government is going to increase the borrowing. But generally what happens in this situation, government is what? Government is saying that their expenditure is 36 lakh crores and their their expenditure is 37 and their receipts is 36. So while presenting that estimates, maybe finance minister is going to insist कि we have restricted our borrowings. We have restricted our borrowings and we are hopeful कि we are going to increase our tax receipts to match this expenditure. Or if we are not able to generate those tax receipts, okay, then we are going to reduce our expenditure by 36 lakh crore, right? So either government is going to say that one thing, right now you can see there is what? There is a deficit in our budget and that deficit is how much? 1 lakh crores. But government is having a very high hope to increase tax revenue by another 1 lakh crore, right? Or even government may say that not tax receipts only, tax plus disinvestments is going to provide another 1 lakh crores, right? So in that way, we are presenting a deficit budget, but we are very hopeful by the end of this financial year, we are going to match up this here and there will be no budget deficit when we are going to close this financial year. One position. Now government further clarified that suppose if we are not going to mop up 1 lakh crores to clear this deficit, maybe government going to further reduce their expenses during the financial year, right? So in that way government may present the deficit budget also. So it is quite possible that there is a budget deficit also, but generally in recent years we have seen that there is a no budget deficit in the estimates of the government, because government will do this thing later on, right? Government is going to present 37 lakh crores as an expenditure and 37 lakh crores as in receipts, and then government will say that we will try to increase our expenditure further by focusing on more tax receipts and more disinvestments. So these things which they earlier say in advance, now they are saying these things after the budget presentation. So there are some complexity in the data is there, right? And we do not expect you to go for such a very complex data analysis, right? What you must have to know is that is first budget deficit, and that is total expenditure minus total receipts. But remember that these receipts are inclusive of borrowings. They are inclusive of what? They are inclusive of borrowings. Here, the borrowings are already included, right? Ha Harsh, this is previous phase two previous question. So we can say that ki budget deficit is inclusive of borrowings, inclusive of borrowings. Now we want to know, because see, borrowings are what? Borrowings are liabilities, right? Which must be paid back. So we want to know that if we will exclude those receipts which are coming to us in the form of liabilities, we want to know budget deficit is showing that the difference between total expenditure and total receipts, right? What is budget deficit? That is difference between TE and TR, right? Now we want to know that if we are going to exclude the liabilities, exclude the liability generated receipts, exclude liability generating receipts, then what will be our deficit? So we call it as a fiscal deficit. And what is it? It is difference between total expenditure and total receipts here. TR is, or you can write simply TR excluding borrowings, right? TR excluding borrowings. So here it can be fiscal deficit is equal to TE minus TR minus borrowings, or in other words, budget deficit plus borrowings, right? That is our fiscal deficit. Fine. So fiscal deficit is one of the most important indicator of countries' overall macroeconomic stability, right? Most important indicator of country's macroeconomic stability. Or in other words, you can say that it is a barometer of country's economy. Whatever you want to can say that it's a heartbeats, or it is the most important data on which every bank or every development institutions, or you can say that the government rating agencies, they always have a closeful watchful eye on country's fiscal deficit. Why? Because it is showing governments, it is going to show that many things. First of all, it is going to show that government's ability to repay debt, government's ability to spend without borrowings, government's total liabilities, right? So all these things are clearly indication of government total ability, right? So this is why the fiscal deficit is most of the important indicator. Irony is, till the 1990s, that means 1991, 1992, till the 1991, 1992, government generally do not present the fiscal deficit data in the public domain, right? It was not presented in the public domain. But from 1991 onwards, Dr. Manmohan Singh started using the presentation of fiscal deficit in the budget, even in the budget speech also. So government explicitly going to show ki how much deficit we do have on our head, right? So this is one of the most important change in the Indian budgeting since 1991. Manmohan Singh started presenting this. It doesn't mean that ki before that we do not have a fiscal deficit data. We do have the data of fiscal deficit, but it was not part of budget speech. But now it is one of the most important thing in the budget speech, and lot of emphasis, explanation, right? So roadmap is given by the government in order to how we are going to manage this fiscal deficit, right? So fiscal deficit is what? Fiscal deficit is a deficit which is exclusive of borrowings. Here we have written what? We have written regarding budget deficit, and this budget deficit is inclusive of what? Borrowings. Here we can write that what? We can write that fiscal deficit is exclusive of borrowings. Okay, it is exclusive of borrowings. Right. Now, fiscal deficit is clear. What is fiscal deficit? Is it clear? Okay, fine. So, as we know that before going for a primary deficit, another type of deficit, few things I just want to write and mention here. Expenditure and receipts. And expenditures, we have two types, that is revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. Here is again revenue and capital receipts. Revenue and capital. So revenue expenditure. What are the constituents, major constituents of revenue expenditure? For example, interest payments. Interest payments, defense, states, share from gross tax receipts. Expenditure on various government sponsored schemes. So these are the major constituents of what? Revenue expenditure, right? These are the major constituents of revenue expenditure. And you can see that the interest payment. So what is interest payment means here? So whenever government is going to borrow the money, right? Government is going to borrow the money, that borrowing have to be repaid with what? Repaid with principal amount plus interest amount, right? So borrowing repaid with what? It is going to be repaid with the principal amount and interest amount. So when government is going to pay, right? Government is going to pay, that means government is going to give, right? Government is going to give. So when government is going to give, they mention the interest payment. They mention the interest payment in the revenue expenditure. So government has borrowed the money and that borrowed money have to be repaid. So government is going to mention the interest payment where? In the revenue head. Whereas government is going to mention principal amount payment on borrowings. Where? In capital head. Interest payments are going to be mentioned where? In the revenue head, where the principal amount payment by the government on the borrowings, it is going to be where? It is going to be mentioned in what? Capital expenditure. Why? The reason is very simple. When government borrow the money, the intention of government is what? The intention for borrowing is capital creation. We are going to borrow the money for capital creation. Capital creation for what? For increasing revenue receipts in future. Means government is going to borrow the money. Suppose, example, government is borrowing 100 rupees and on this 100 rupees government have to pay 100 plus 6, right? So this is going to be what? Capital expenditure, and this is going to be what? This is going to be revenue expenditure. Why? Because government is going to use this 100 rupees for what? Capital creation. So this 100 rupees is going to be spent for the capital creation so that in future we can start generating more income. Why more income? If we are not going to put this money for more capital creation, how we are going to repay that debt? So what is the philosophy? Philosophy is that we are borrowing the money, and with this borrowed money we are going to spend so that we can increase our earnings. And once our earnings are going to be increased, we will start repaying that debt and its interest payment also. So this 100 rupees is going to create a capital, but this interest payment is not going to create any capital assets. It's a liability, pure liability. Whereas this is also a liability. 100 rupees, the principal amount is also liability, but that liability is going to create an assets. So that is why the principal amount payment on the borrowings, they are part of what? They are part of capital expenditure, and interest payments are part of revenue expenditure. So apart from this, what are the other part of capital expenditure? Other part of capital expenditure is expenditure on infrastructure. Expenditure on infrastructure, right? So expenditure on infrastructure is also part of what? Capital expenditure. So this is revenue expenditure, this is capital expenditure. Fine. So now if we talk strictly, if I'll talk strictly about this PDF is finished. So okay, I'll try to first explain here. So if we talk about financial year, better to have on next PDF. So for financial year 2022-23, right? 2022-23, government is going to spend 36 lakh crore, right? Not exact data, just an approximate data for your understanding. So government said that they are going to spend 36 lakh crores in financial year 2022-2023. Now, if we'll ask a question to government, our question to government is how much government is going to spend for financial year 2022-2023. Government is going to spend how much? Government is going to spend 36 lakh crores for financial year 2022-2023. Right? In financial year 2022-2023, the total amount is going to be spent for 36 lakh crores. But our question is ki how much you are going to spend for financial year 2022-2023. So what is the difference between what? Difference between for and in. In means the total amount, and this 36 lakhs is includes interest payments. This includes this 36 lakh crore which is government is going to spend in this 2022-2023. That inclusive of what? Interest payments. But that interest payment is because of previous year's borrowing, right? This interest payment is for because of previous year's borrowing. Our question to government is we just want to know how much you are going to spend for financial year 2022-2023. What interest payment government is showing? Suppose that key interest payment, e.g., example is somewhere around 6 lakh crores or 4 lakh crores. 4 lakh crore is what? Interest payment. So 36 lakh crore is going to be spent in 22-23. But out of this 36, 4 lakh crore is what? interest payments. That means actually for financial year 2022-2023, government is going to spend 36 or 32 lakh crores. How much government is going to spend? 36 or 32 lakh crores. For financial year 2022-2023, government will spend 32 lakh crore because this is the interest payment of previous year's liability repayment. For this financial year, we are going to spend how much? We are going to spend only 32 lakh crores. How we came to this formula? We did what? Total expenditure, then minus interest payments. Total expenditure minus interest payment. By this, we came to this data, right? Similarly, if we are going to ask government ki how much you are going to earn this year, how much you are going to earn this year, how much you are going to receive this year without borrowings or without any liability, right? So for that, government receipts without any liabilities, they are going to be what? TR minus B. That is going to be what? TR minus B. So that means if we want to know ki what is the actual position, what is an actual position of government in financial year 2022-2023, for that we are going to do this total expenditure minus interest payment, then total receipts minus borrowings. Fine. And then we have to open this formula TE minus TR plus borrowings minus interest payments. So TE minus TR plus borrowings is what? Fiscal deficit minus interest payments, right? So fiscal deficit minus interest payment is going to be called as primary deficit. It's going to be known as primary deficit, right? So in this way, we calculate the primary deficit. So what is primary deficit? Primary deficit, those people who are not able to understand this equation or this primary deficit, for them in the most simplest way, for example, May month, right, just started yesterday. The month of May started yesterday. So I ask a person A ki how much total expenditure you have, right? For month A, how much total expenditure he have? He told me 1 lakh. 1 lakh is my total expenditure, right? 1 lakh is my total expenditure, and actually it is 80K plus 20K. So I said, what is 20K? So he said that interest payments. He said that interest payment I have to pay because I took some loan. So this month I am going to make an interest payment, right, of that. So I said, okay. Then I asked how much earning you have. So he said that my actual earning is 70,000. My actual earning is 70,000, but in order to fulfill that expenditure, I borrowed again 30,000 for this month. I am borrowing how much? 30,000 this month in order to fulfill that expenditure. I said, okay. Then if we will calculate how much budget deficit he is have. So budget deficit 1 lakh is total expenditure and total receipts. Budget deficit is going to be 0. But if we will calculate fiscal deficit fiscal deficit is going to be how much? Fiscal deficit, total expenditure 1 lakh, total receipts is 1 lakh, but borrowing is of how much? 30,000. So his fiscal deficit is 30K. Now, if we will analyze his situation and we just want to know what is his liabilities, total liabilities. This is his total liabilities for month of May. But if we want to know what is his liability, not total liability in the month of May, for month of May. So for month of May, he need how much only? He need only 80,000 crore to spend. Sorry, 80,000. 80,000 he have to spend in this month. He have to spend how much? 80,000. But he have to spend 1 lakh because he have a previous liability. That is a liability of previous months. For only the month of May, he have to spend how much? 80,000. And how much he is earning in the month of May? 70,000. So his primary deficit for May month is only 10K, 10,000. So primary deficit shows your present condition. Primary deficit shows your present condition, whereas fiscal deficit shows your overall condition. Fine, your overall condition. For example, suppose in the same case, if he is going to say that no, actually my expenditure is not 80,000, our expenditure is only 70,000. Right? Our expenditure is how much? 70,000. So his expenditure is 70,000. Right? In that case, primary deficit is going to be what? 0. Why? He is going to receive 70,000 in terms of what? He is going to receive 70,000 in terms of his own earning. So his present situation, even if we will not take this example, otherwise maybe you will get confused, right? So suppose that if we will not take this example, just stick to this example only, we can see that his present situation, in the present context, he have the liability of 10K, right? Whereas his overall liability is what? 30K. So when we want to analyze our overall situation and our present situation, when we analyze our overall situation and our present situation, that's why we use what? That's why we use the concept of fiscal deficit and primary deficit. So this is for present financial year's actual position, which excludes interest payments and borrowings of present financial year, right? Whereas fiscal deficit shows what? Total position of financial year excluding of borrowings. Excluding of what? Borrowings. Fine. So this is why the fiscal deficit is the most important indicator. You can see that it is showing your overall position, whereas primary deficit is showing what? Primary deficit is showing your present condition. Now, still the more emphasis is going to be on what? The more emphasis is going to be what? Fiscal deficit. Why? it is going to show your overall position. So if you are able to improve your overall position, then gradually and automatically your present condition is also going to improve. Some people feel that if we are able to improve our present situation, means if we will do the hard work right now, then our future will be better. But here in this case, because the fiscal deficit is going to show your all previous liabilities also, it is going to include all your previous liabilities also, because here the interest payment is included, here the interest payment is included, and here interest payment in primary deficit, interest payment is not included. So fiscal deficit is showing your what? Overall situation, your past and present, right? And sometimes it is said that it is your past which define your present and future. Fine. So that is the classic case where the fiscal deficit is going to be fit. So fiscal deficit is showing your past and present overall. So your past and present is going to shape your coming future, that is coming present. So coming present means the future. Fine. So this is why the fiscal deficit is most important indicator. Chetan is asking, means primary deficit will be the total liabilities of the present government. No, no. Primary deficit means it's a liabilities and means the difference of your liabilities and your receivings in this financial year. In this financial year, see what I have did. I have exclude the liability part, interest payment part, and I have exclude the borrowing part. So primary deficit it's showing the present financial year's position. It is showing present financial year's position. Present financial year's position, whereas fiscal deficit is showing your overall position. Okay, so this is how this thing is going to be done. So in fiscal deficit, right, if the question is going to be asked to write about the fiscal deficit, right, so I will request to all of you, keep the formula in your mind, then start writing. After writing, if you will present the formula there, then it is going to be more problematic for you, right? So it's better to first give the formula in the writing, right? Then you can write it further. Otherwise, it will be a problem. I didn't have to do anything with the government. Okay, so we understood till then now three things. One is BD, then it is FD, and it is PD. Now we have to understand what is revenue deficit and effective revenue deficit, right? What is revenue deficit and what is effective revenue deficit? Okay, so when we have to find out revenue deficit, it's simple formula: revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts. Revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts. So what are the heads of revenue expenditure? We have seen here the revenue expenditure is comprised of what? Interest payment, defense, state share from the gross tax receipt, then expenditure on various government sponsored schemes. These are the major head of what? These are the major head of revenue expenditure. Now we have to see what are the major heads of revenue receipts, right? Revenue receipts, that is comprised of what? That is comprised of non-tax receipts and tax receipts. Non-tax receipts and tax receipts. And we know that the tax are of two types. One is direct tax and other is indirect tax. One is direct tax and one is indirect tax. So non-tax receipts comprise of what? Dividend paid by public sector enterprises. Dividend paid by public sector enterprises, public sector undertaking, whatever. I have already explained in detail about public sector enterprises and public sector undertaking. Right. So dividend, they will pay their profit shares. Right. Then apart from that, fee, fine collected by government. Right. Fees and fine collected by what? Fees and fine collected by government. Whereas when we will go for direct taxes, here income tax, corporation tax, securities transaction tax, then DDT, that is dividend distribution tax, right? And other is capital gain tax. So these are the major example of what? Direct tax, whereas indirect tax inclusive of GST, custom duties, central sales tax, right? So these are example of what? These are example of government's revenue receipts. And in last class, I told you that revenue expenditure shows basically government's obligation and those expenditures which do not create any asset, right? Means here in the revenue expenditure, first of all, we have to fulfill our obligation, whatever the obligation we have on our head in the form of interest payments. After the interest payment, we are going to spend the money. You can see that defense, state shares on the gross tax receipts, then expenditure on various government sponsored schemes. So in other words, revenue expenditure shows government's ability to spend money on the welfare of the people. Government's ability to spend money on the welfare of the people means high revenue expenditure means कि government have lot of capability to provide better facilities, to better services to their country people. Fine. So this is in that context, revenue expenditure is very important. And in order to fulfill the revenue expenditure, what sources of income do you have, right? So if we have less income, that means our revenue expenditure is also going to be less. Why? If suppose for fulfilling this expenditure, the revenue expenditure, which is not going to create any income for the government, and government is going to borrow the money for that. If you started borrowing money for purpose of what? Your revenue expenditure, then the problem is that government's deficit is going to increase and increase. Carry forwarded. It is going to increase further increase. You can see the situation in Sri Lanka. You can see situation in many countries. Those who are going for too much populist measure. Why it is called populist measure? When it is called populist measure, when you started spending the money to just please the people, right? But you do not have proper sources of income in order to fulfill those promises. You made the promise that we are going to provide this thing free, that thing free, everything is free. You have said that. But okay, if you have resources to make it free, go for it. Go for it for the welfare of the people. But if you do not have any proper backing in order to fulfill those expenditures, then you should not provide free to everyone, but you must provide free or at very minimum cost to most needy people who are inefficient, who are not able to generate because of their poor economic status. For them, you can make the free. For them, you can provide it at lowest cost, and you can take more money from those people who are capable enough. So that is okay. But when government is heading towards such kind of the policy, ki, okay, we are going to provide free, but government do not have a proper backing in order to fulfill that expenditure, then definitely you are going to borrow the money, and with that borrowings, you are going to fulfill your promise. And when you are going to fulfill your promise by the borrowings, that means later on you have to pay the principal amount and interest amount. So principal amount is going to increase and interest amount is also going to increase, and you do not have extra sources of income, then definitely your government is going to be in deep crisis. Sri Lanka is kind of a island nation. For them, the most important source of income is tourism. Okay. For them, the most important source of income is tourism. And during the COVID times, their source of income is much depleted. Whereas these Rajpakshas who are ruling Sri Lanka right now, they went for a lot of populist measure, number one. Number two, apart from the populist measure, they have ruined some of the sources of their own income. For example, they said that we are going for only organic farming, we are not going to use the fertilizers. So the income sources which you started killing those sources of income, right? In past, you have borrowed a lot of money internally and externally. Especially externally, you have borrowed a lot of money and you have not spent those money for the purpose of pushing your economy. Rather than you have spent those money to please your country's population in order to get re-elected. So country people get very happy and they re-elected you, right? But after that, what happened? Because your income sources is not increased, in fact that started depleting. Why? You have took the wrong policy measure in the field of agriculture, one thing. Another thing, your tourist generated income because of COVID is almost zero. So income starts decreasing, expenditures are remain there. Then you can see that those people who have voted Rajpakshas with very warm heart, okay, Rajpaksha are going to rule this country and they are going to change the destiny. Now these people on the street and they want to take you away from the power, right? So being as an administrator, being as a government official, you must realize this thing. Those people who are with you, maybe they are against you after a certain point of time. So your job is not to please them, but your job is to make them realize that these are the ways you can strengthen yourself, and we are here to help you in order to strengthen you, right? So you can go for what? Revenue expenditure. It's absolutely fine. But for revenue expenditure, you should not go for what? Borrowings. But still, sometimes government have to borrow for it. And how we are going to know that government is going to borrow to fulfill those expenditures which are having a revenue expenditure in the nature? And for that, we are going to calculate what? Revenue deficit, that is revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts. And if you have any revenue deficit, it is going to show that for that revenue expenditure, government is going to do what? Government have to go for borrowings, or government have to decrease their revenue expenditure. See, if you have deficit here, revenue expenditure minus revenue receipt, some amount, suppose that X amount is the revenue deficit. So how you are going to fulfill the deficit? Definitely you are going to do what? Use the borrowings or disinvestments. So it is going to create what? Liabilities. And it is going to what? Decrease assets. So this is why the revenue deficit is an important part of country's government's ability. That means if your revenue receipts are increasing, right? For example, here the revenue receipts, the most important constituent is what? Tax, right? So tax. So generally there is a what? Tax to, there is a concept known as tax to GDP ratio. Another indicator, right? Once you will visit the doctor, he is going to check few things. Fine, when you are going to visit the doctor, so some basic things have to be checked. So for a country, tax to GDP ratio. Another is debt to GDP ratio, and other is fiscal deficit. Other is fiscal deficit, right? So hota hai na, means let's match the kundali, right? So these are three important indicators of your kundali. Your kundali is going to say what kind of the person you may be in future, right? So these are the three important indicator: tax to GDP, debt to GDP, and fiscal deficit, right? So this fiscal deficit of country's government, right? Fiscal deficit and tax to GDP ratio. Tax to GDP ratio means if you are earning, government of India is saying that ki our GDP is 100, right? Our GDP means what? Our total income generated through production is 100, and our tax receipts is rupees 60 worth. So we are generating the income of how much? 100 rupees. And out of that 100 rupees, we are able to collect the tax of 60 rupees. So if your tax to GDP ratio is 68, or yes, suppose that your tax to GDP ratio is 68 or 58, what it means that? It means that out of 100, government is getting 58 rupees through tax. Now your GDP, which was 100 to 60, your GDP and tax is 100 to 60. Now you are saying that our GDP is 1000. Our GDP is how much? Our GDP is 1000. Fine. But our our taxable income is 540. So earlier you was having tax to GDP ratio of, here you are having the tax to GDP ratio of 60. Now here the tax to GDP ratio is decreased to what? 54. So maybe country's government is able to increase what? Able to increase the production related income. But government's taxable income is not rising. It means that for government it is going to be getting little bit difficult to fulfill the revenue expenditure. It is going to be more difficult. So generally it is assumed that when your GDP is going to rise, right? Your GDP is going to rise, then your taxable income is also going to rise. Fine. So same equation, but small change. Suppose that your income from 100 to 1000, and your tax to GDP means your taxable income is 68, right? So your taxable income increase from 60 to 680. Your taxable income increase from 60 to 680, and in meantime your income your income, your GDP has increased from 100 to 1000. Suppose that this is 5 years duration. In the 5 years duration, country's GDP rise from 100 to 1000. Fine. So can you tell me what is the percentage of growth of this country from in the 5 year, right? In the 5 year, we have went from 100 to 1000. In the 5 year, we went from 100 to 1000. Can you tell me, while using your mathematical ability, can you tell me what is an average growth rate of per year? They went from 100 to 1000 in 5 years. So what is their average growth rate of this 5 year? Anyone? Anyone? Acha, okay, you can calculate it later. What I just want to let you know is here is, if we will say the rise in the GDP, GDP rise from 100 to 1000, and your taxable income rise from 60 to 680. So you have to check which one have a higher average growth rate in 5 years. GDP increase from what? GDP is increasing from 100 to what? It is increasing from 100 to 1000. So there is a rise in the 5 year. Again, when we are looking towards what? Tax. So tax is also rising. Tax is also rising. So we have to check, with every increase in the GDP, is our tax rate, is taxable income is also rising or not? So we can say that yes, it is rising. It is clearly visible, it is rising. But we want to check which one have higher growth rate. Which one have higher rate of growth? GDP increased from 100 to 1000, whereas taxable income is what? Rise from 60 to 680. Both increased. So if we are going to find, okay, the rate of growth of GDP is higher than the rate of growth of what? Rate of growth of taxable income. We can say that it is inelastic. Inelastic because our GDP is rising with fast pace, but our taxable income is not rising with that pace. Then we say that it is inelastic in the nature. Whereas 100, then it is 60. Next year, suppose that again it is 100, but that is now 58. Again it is 100, it is 54. So you are getting that income, but you can consistently see that your taxable income is what? Taxable income is consistently getting dropped. So we cannot see the same change or similar change in the taxable income. We are seeing that it is decreasing. So we can say that it is inelastic. But when we saw that, what? Our GDP is rising, taxable income is rising, but the rise in the taxable income is matching or even greater than our GDP. Then it is what? Then it is an elastic tax to GDP ratio. And rising the taxes means we can decrease our what? We can decrease our revenue deficit. Revenue deficit we can decrease in the very fast pace. For example, have you seen that today government has provided the data that we have somewhere around 1.68 lakh crores collection of what? Collection of GST in the month of April. So if you will compare last year's this GST collection and this year's GST collection, so in comparison to last year 2021 April 2021 and April 2022, right? So here GDP and GST. if you will compare GDP of April 2021 and April 2022 GDP, definitely April 2022 GDP is higher than April 2021 GDP. That for sure. But once you are going to compare the GST collection of last year in the same month and GST collection of this year in the same month, you will find that this year the rate of rise of the GST is much higher than from the last year in comparison to rise in the rate of GDP. So GDP and what? GDP is rising and taxes also rising. But what we have seen, this is GDP, this is the tax, right? This is the GDP and this is the tax. So both are rising, but this time the rise of the pace of what? This time the rise of the pace of GST is higher than the rise in the pace or rise in the rate of GDP. So this is very significant indication of robust recovery of Indian economy because government is able to get more tax, right? That may be possible because government has tightened the norms of all these e-way bills and each and everything. That's why those people who are still means away from the GST, now they also have to pay the GST. That may be the reason, but overall result is good. Fine. So tax to GDP ratio is very important. Similarly, what is debt to GDP ratio? Debt to GDP ratio means your GDP is 100 and for that you borrowed 70 rupees. Government, India's GDP is 70. But for generating this GDP, Indian government borrowed 70 rupees. So it is going to show the ratio between overall country's GDP and the amount country have borrowed. Fine. So in that way, debt to GDP ratio. Fiscal deficit, I already explained to you how the fiscal deficit is going to the most important indicator, and if fiscal deficit is decreasing or it is under control, that means automatically tax to GDP ratio is improving, debt to GDP ratio is also under the control. So in that way, this thing happen, right? I hope you have the clarity regarding debt to GDP, fiscal deficit, and tax to GDP ratio. Clear? Okay. Now, after revenue deficit, we must know what is effective revenue formula is revenue expenditure minus gross capital formation by states minus revenue receipts. Now we have to understand what it means that gross capital formation by the states. So if you will means just if we can open the equation, it is going to be RE minus RR minus GCF by states or revenue deficit minus GCF, right? So revenue deficit is minus GCF. So in other words, you can say that effective revenue deficit is going to be less than what? Revenue deficit. So effective revenue deficit is always going to be less than what? Revenue deficit, because we have to exclude gross capital formation by the states. Right. Now understand what is gross capital formation by the states. Under constitutional obligation, under constitutional obligation, government of India, government of India from its tax revenue. Government of India from its tax revenue have to share with states as per recommendation of Finance Commission. As per recommendation of Finance Commission. Sir, one doubt, are these only economic indicators or they are other indicators also? No, these are only economic indicators. These are economic indicators, means they are going to show the financial health of a country. Right. Uh, it's something, sometimes it's like that ki, see, most of the people will suggest you ki don't eat oily food, right? It is going to be problematic for you. Fine. So just my example, if everybody is going to say that ki fatty food, fatty food, fatty food, yes, I know that is fatty food, but my body is more adaptive than your body, right? So my metabolism is higher than maybe the other person who is suggesting me you don't eat oily food. So I eat oily food and I am able to digest, right? I'm able to digest. Yes, I'm overweight. I'm overweight, but I'm not overweight like you. If you are going to eat the same food, then maybe you are going to gain the weight in more faster way in comparison to me, because my metabolism is stronger than your metabolism, right? So maybe India, for example, India have a good GDP growth rate, right? But India's tax to GDP ratio is comparatively low with respect to other economies, and India's debt to GDP ratio is higher than other economies. But if you will compare India's GDP growth rate, overall India's GDP growth rate is much, much higher than other countries. Fine. So all these are going to what? After assessment of overall situation. Okay, what is the debt to GDP ratio situation? What is tax to GDP ratio situation? So for example, in the case of India, India's GDP is growing with very fast rate pace, but taxable income is not rising as with the rise in the GDP growth rate, whereas regarding the debt is remain very high for the government of India. So some people questions your ability of today. You have higher borrowings and your taxable income is not rising with the fast pace. But others say that ki, okay, maybe not rising right now, but the way Indian economy is growing in the coming years, definitely Indian economy is also going to be have very good tax to GDP ratio, as well as debt to GDP ratio is going to decrease. So these are economic indicators for the prediction of your economic health. Some people, some countries have low tax to GDP ratio, sorry, low debt to GDP ratio. They have low debt to GDP ratio, but their GDP growth rate is low, right? So we cannot say that ki they are better than India, right? They are better than India. So these are some such just an indicator, nothing else. Okay, they are just an indicator, not more than that. Okay, so government from its tax revenue have to share with states as per recommendation of Finance Commission. And I already told you कि what government have to share. That share is going to be part of GOI's revenue expenditure. So what amount you are going to give whom? What amount you are going to give to states, you are going to mention in where? Revenue expenditure, right? Revenue expenditure. Fine. So government of India has given some amount to whom? States. So example, tax revenue of GOI is rupees 100, right? Tax revenue is 100. 15th FC recommended 42 to be given to whom? States. 42 should be given to whom? States. So what government of India is going to do? This 42 is going to be the part of revenue expenditure of GOI, right? It is going to be the part of government of India's revenue expenditure. But this is going to whom? This 42 going to state. This 42 is going to state. Now state which receive 42, they can go for both revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. This 42 rupees is going to whom? States. Now states have received 42 rupees. They can go for revenue expenditure. They can go for capital expenditure. That is up to the states. So out of 42, out of this 42, suppose that X rupee is expended on what? Revenue expenditure, and state has spent Y rupee on capital expenditure. So now the question is here, the revenue deficit is equal to revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts. And this revenue expenditure is inclusive of states' share in states' shares from tax receipt of GOI. Suppose it is M. So this RE is what? RE is inclusive of what? M. So what people are saying that ki see, you should not include M. You should mention what? You should mention M minus Y. Because this Y amount they are going to spend on what? Capital expenditure. And government of India has given 42, right? This is M. So RE is inclusive of what? RE is inclusive of M. M is the complete amount. But out of that complete amount, state government is going to spend that Y amount on what? State government is going to spend that Y amount on the capital formation. But government of India is showing the entire M amount in their revenue expenditure. Revenue expenditure means the money just spent on what? The money which is spent on only revenue expenses. But the M is comprised of X plus Y. X is the revenue expenditure by the states, and Y is capital expenditure by the state. So that's why some people are suggesting that we must exclude the money spent by the states on capital formation, the money which was given by union to them, right? So they arrive the formula of effective revenue deficit by saying RE minus what? RE minus Y. RE minus Y. This amount Y, RE minus Y minus RR. RE minus Y minus RR. And this Y is known as what? This Y is known as gross capital formation by states. Gross capital formation by the states, right? So this is what this is known as effective revenue deficit, right? This is known as effective revenue deficit. We have excluded the money which we have given to states, and states use the same money for capital formation, right? So the money given by the union, right, under the revenue head obligation, but that amount of money, some part of that money is used by the states for the purpose of capital formation. That's why we have to exclude it from there. It is known as effective revenue deficit, right? Why is not just a grant? Why is a mandatory grants have to be given by what? See, Government of India have to provide two type of the grants to whom? States. One grant is mandatory grants under the what? Finance Commission's recommendation. Other is that is known as discretionary grants, right? Discretionary grants. That discretionary grants can be given by the union on his will and wishes to the state government. For example, sometimes Bihar Chief Minister Nitish Kumar, they ask many times that Bihar need a special package. So this special package is on discretion of whom? Union government. So that is the discretionary grant. Whereas the under the Finance Commission, that is mandatory grants. So when we are going to use this effective revenue deficit, we are going to calculate gross capital formation of what? Of the money which is given by the union under the recommendation of Finance Commission. So mandatory grants का part. Okay. Clear? Discretionary grants, most of the time they are arbitrary in the nature. How much you have given to the particular states, that is not clearly mentioned, right? So it's very difficult to find it out. So it's better to have a certain certainty only. Even this concept of effective revenue deficit was started only in 2012. Before that, we was not calculating this effective revenue deficit. Started in 2012 only. Before that, even we was not calculating it. Right. So there are some practical difficulties to gather the data. In fact, this data is also based on what? This Y data is based on just a kind of data given by the state. Actually, this is happening or not, nobody knows. What government of state government said that okay, we are going to, you are collecting the data, so you have seen the difference between what is on the government paper and what is in the reality, right? So it's some similar thing like that. Okay. Now, till then here we have discussed about these deficit. That first one was budget deficit, that is TE minus TR. Then we went for fiscal deficit, that is budget deficit minus borrowings, primary deficit is equal to fiscal deficit is budget deficit plus borrowing, sorry. Fiscal deficit minus interest payments. RE minus RR, then okay, so these are formulas, and this one, and because of this one we have this one, because of borrowings we have interest payments. So managing the borrowings, or you can say that debt management. Debt management play a very crucial role, because that debt management is going to define the fiscal deficit, and this fiscal deficit is also going to define what? Interest payments, tax to GDP ratio, tax to debt to GDP ratio, your economic growth, all these things. If government is going to increase the borrowings, right? If government is going to increase the borrowings, if government is going to increase borrowings, right? If government is going to increase the borrowing, what will happen? Possibility of crowding out. Possibility of crowding out, because at a given time in our economy we have limited availability of money, right? We have a limited availability of money in the economy, and if major chunk of that money is going to be borrowed by whom? Borrowed by government, right? Then the less amount of money is going to be available for private sector. Then crowding out can happen because of rise in market interest rates. Market interest rates will be rise, because whatever the money was there, large amount of money is absorbed by whom? Large amount of money is absorbed by the government, right? And that money absorbed by the government, that is why it is going to create a problem for whom? Private sector, right? Another problem with the borrowing is, can trigger high inflation. More money spending by the government, that means more money through the government, and especially if that money is going to be what? Under the revenue head, right? Then the more money is going to be available in the economy. Why? Government is borrowing too much, and that created what? That created a problem for the private sector, and interest rates starts increasing. In order to bring down the interest rates for the private sector for increasing our GDP, maybe money supply can be increased by RBI. And if money supply is also increased by RBI, government is also increasing its borrowing, then there is a chance of rising inflation in the economy. Fine. So this is why the government borrowings play a very important role. And this government borrowing is managed by whom? This government debt management of GOI is by RBI, right? This debt management by RBI. Now RBI is having a conflict of interest. How? Most of the time what they are doing, they have responsibility to what? They have responsibility for inflation management, and most of the time what they are trying to do, they are trying to bring it down the inflation, right? And you know that to bring down the inflation, government RBI have to control the money supply, right? Money supply should not be increased, and the same RBI is doing what? You are providing money to whom? You are providing money to government of India. So you are providing money to government of India. So through government of India, money supply will be increased in economy. So when government will go for higher borrowings, then definitely that money will come to the economy. So at one side, RBI is providing all kind of the financial support to government, and that money is going to be in our economy, right? It is going to increase. So at one point, RBI is facilitating more money to government, and that money is going to cause an higher inflation. And at the same time, you are also trying to control the inflation. So RBI must have the clarity here which role is more important at particular point of time, right? So RBI must have very clarity in his functioning which is more important work to manage as per the situation of the economy. And if it is under influence of government, then maybe if RBI is under the influence of government, then maybe RBI is not able to focus on what? Inflation management, and RBI is going to do what? RBI is going to more focus on facilitation of government borrowings. Right. So in theory, maybe now as per law, RBI is what? RBI is inflation controlling central bank under monetary policy framework. Under MPC framework, RBI is now inflation controlling bank, inflation controlling central bank under the monetary policy framework. But that is in theory. In practical, still RBI is providing a lot of support to whom? RBI is still providing a lot of support to government. So that must be very clear for the Reserve Bank of India. In other words, we can say that in order to have better fiscal policy and monetary policy balance, the independence of central bank is highly essential, and government should not push too much on the central bank, and government must put themselves under certain discipline, right? So in order to fulfill all those things, government of India has passed fiscal responsibility and budgetary management Act 2003 in Parliament. In short, it is known as FRBM Act 2003. What was an objective? The major objective of government is to control and restrict fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit, in order to control and restrict fiscal deficit. For this objective, we have passed this FRBM Act. Fiscal deficit, or in other words, government must have to restrict its borrowing, because if government is going to borrow too much, it is going to create a lot of pressure on monetary policy also. So government must restrict its fiscal deficit and borrowing, and government must have to make more efforts to increase its taxable revenue, or in other words, government must have to try to increase its tax to GDP ratio, right? Though there are no certain targets mentioned in that FRBM Act regarding how to increase your tax to GDP ratio, how to decrease your debt to GDP ratio. But for fiscal deficit, they have set the target of 3% of India's GDP. Right. So in 2003, they have set a roadmap for next 5-6 years. Ki by 5 year, Indian government have to try to make their fiscal deficit is equal to 3% of GDP. Right. So that was a target set by the government when they have passed Fiscal Responsibility and Budgetary Management Act. They set the target of 3% of GDP, what? Fiscal deficit. But the problem was ki when you are setting the target, suppose that you are setting the target in 2003, ki we are going to make 3% of GDP. Fiscal deficit 3% of GDP, and you are setting this target for 2008. Fine. So suppose that your GDP is 100. GDP is 100, right? So GDP is 100 in which year? In year 2003. Now in 2008, your GDP is 150. Your GDP is 150. So you thought that it is going to be what? It is going to be 3%. out of 100 it is going to be 3 only. Now you have to achieve the target of what? 4.4, 4.5. So you set the target of 3, but actually it is going to be target of 4.5. As GDP is going to increase, it is going to be little bit difficult for you to minimize it, right? One technical issue. That was a technical issue. And there are some unfortunate or without controlled issue. For example, in 2007-8, global financial crisis has hit the economy all over the world, and in the vicinity of that crisis, government must have to stimulate the economy by providing fiscal stimulus. Fiscal stimulus means you have to provide a money to all the sectors, and if government have to provide money to all the sectors, especially banking sector, in order to prevent any meltdown or crisis, that means government have to go for more borrowings. And if government is going to go for more borrowings or exceptional increase in the borrowings, then for that year and for upcoming 3-4 years, it is not possible for the government to achieve those fiscal deficit target which they have set in FRBM Act. So the target which was set for 2007-8, those targets were shifted for 2011-12. But 11-12 you found that still it is not possible to achieve. Then you further shifted for 2014-15. Finally in 2014-15 government found that it is practically not possible. So you must review the situation. You must review the situation what is possible. Then you have went for a review committee on FRBM, the review committee on FRBM, and to assess is it possible. Then review committee said that no, it is highly impossible to get this 3% in nearby. You have set the target by 2024 we can achieve this target. But again what happened? COVID had hit the economy. And now what you have set by 2024 we will try to achieve 3%. It is again not possible. Even recently when RBI has released its currency report, RBI said that it is going to be another 10 years to fully recover from what? Fully recover from the shock given by the COVID crisis. So again it is going to be what? Again it is going to be not possible for the government to fulfill that commitment, right? So okay, if you are not even able to fulfill, even government can try to go nearby those targets and show that the government has made a good effort, right? So all these things are the points which we must have in our mind while going to attempt any answer, right? Answer of the question which generally they do ask in what? In the previous years. So the Fiscal Responsibility Budgetary Management Act, right? Uh, okay. So for this, explain the concept, feature, and the recent changes in the Fiscal Responsibility and Budgetary Management Act 2003 in the context of limiting India's fiscal deficit and debt deficit, right? So this is what just I discussed with you, right? This is what I just discussed with you. What happened there? In 2003, you have passed the act. It is almost 20 years and still you are away, right? Still you are away because what we said theoretically, we have to implement at the practical level. But at the practical level, things are not like in the simulated environment. In the practical environment, things are more complicated and more unexpected things have to come. This is why, despite having our goals and target, it is quite difficult for country like India, which is already have many structural problems like our over dependence on monsoon, our energy deficiency. So these are two, sorry, not structural problem, functional problem. These are two functional problem of Indian economy, and for that, don't know means maybe things are going well, But if these two crises will come, then entire stability is going to be disturbed. So these are certain limitations on implementation of Fiscal Responsibility and Budgetary Management Act. Fine. So I will write an answer on it, especially for the question number 7. I will write an answer because the rest of the thing I already mentioned in very meticulous way in this PDF, which the topic when I have started on 30th of April. You can see that I have mentioned here what 30th of April, and then in today's lecture, right? I have mentioned all these things. Fine. So I will share these two PDF. These two PDF I will share with you. Plus, I will also share model answer on the question number 7, and if possible I will also incorporate other answers, but I'm not giving any kind of guarantee कि no I'm going to provide the model answer of all 9 questions. It is not possible for me. I tell you very clearly, right? But where it is possible I will give it to you. Apart from this, whatever I have committed, this 2 PDF plus the answer of this question number 7, if possible, I will also provide you certain model kind of answer so that you can get a clue from it. Okay. इकोनॉमिक सर्वे के लिए कुछ बताओ, क्या बताओ इकोनॉमिक सर्वे के लिए, क्या बताओ इकोनॉमिक सर्वे के लिए, क्या जानना चाहते हो इकोनॉमिक सर्वे के लिए, बोलो. I think on your course, the extract of economic survey is already there. So just go through that extract. Nothing else is required. Economic survey पढ़ने का time थोड़ी ना है. Means they are not going to ask the economic survey. And regarding anything related to descriptive part from the economic survey, first just finish it up the part 1, means the objective part, and descriptive part I'll discuss those things, don't worry. And regarding current affairs, one more thing I just want to clarify. See, providing the current affairs for stage 1, it's not possible for me because that current affairs includes a lot of things and I'm not able to do those things. But yes, for part 2, that finance, economy, environment, all these issues which are recently in the news, I am going to cover for last 6 months. So Vrishali was asking. यस मनीष, वो पीडीएफ जो है ना, दैट पीडीएफ that is sufficient for tier 1. For the descriptive part I'll provide more inputs, but for that part it is more than sufficient. You need not to go for anything else. That is more than sufficient. Fine. For tier 2, I'll discuss once the first part will be over. I'll discuss the questions and I'll provide you more input. So don't worry for the part 2. The same thing for the current affairs also. For current affairs for part 1, it's impossible for me, I tell you honestly, because that current affairs is having each and everything from every field, and it is not possible for me to cover all those things in the classes, right? So I believe ki what I am capable of doing the justice with the finance, economy and environment, social issues related things, I can cover that thing, and in the descriptive manner with the conceptual clarity and how to write those things, I can do that, and I will definitely do it. Okay. So I hope things are clear right now. Quizzed for phase 1 CA. Sir, please ask. Okay, okay, I'll ask. I will ask him. Okay. Chalo then. So for tomorrow's topic, I'll share with you on that group, and I'll also share the PDF by tomorrow morning, not tonight. Tomorrow morning, all this PDF I have to check if it is possible to add something more here. I will add it, and then I'll provide you in the morning the model answer part and this annotation PDF. I will send it to you tomorrow morning. PIB, that is more than sufficient. इसके बाद और कुछ नहीं करना है. You have to consolidate. If you are doing PIB already, then nothing is required. Just consolidate the PIB का part, right? No material can go for more than means 70% of the questions. There will be always some deficiency. Whatever the material you are going to refer, it is not going to provide you the 100% ability to correct all those questions they are going to ask from the current affairs. So the point is, you should rely on the most reliable material, right? And do the revision, multiple revision, rather than trying to go for Herculean task, 700-800 pages current affairs or 1,000 pages current affairs or 2,000 pages current affairs of last 6 months. That is absolutely nonsense, right? Because that is competitive exam, and getting the negative is more problematic. Okay, so have this thing in your mind. Okay, so then I'm winding up this today's session. See you tomorrow at 8:30. Okay? Thank you.